It's so good to be back. I guess I don't come often enough because everybody thinks I'm new. Like, hi, I'm just like, 2.5 years I've been here. So I guess that's on me that I'm not as well known. But hopefully we'll change all that. So. Soon. All right, we got to get right in. With an average of 38,000 deaths from gun violence and nearly 85,000 gun-related injuries annually, the gun epidemic is one of the leading causes of preventable premature death in the United States, from Chicago, Westchester, Pennsylvania, Inglewood, and Atlanta. Many believe that gun violence is at an all-time high. Some believe that we as a people are facing a moral crisis, and our nation is at a pivotal crossroads. What will we become if we fail to respond to the proliferation of violence that have so polarized our civilization? There is an estimated nearly 300 million guns in circulation nationwide. Now, if your position is in abolishing all guns, just know that it is highly unlikely that gun ownership would be banned or that the Second Amendment would be repealed in any foreseeable future. This, for me, is not an easy subject to discuss, and the pulpit is rarely the place to delve into such a polarizing and complex issue with many points of view. I am not a constitutional attorney nor a sociologist studying gun violence in this country, but as a minister who is concerned with the ethical issues we face, I begin by acknowledging that today I stand with the majority of American citizens who would like to see some common sense regulation, such as a universal background check system that would prevent people with criminal records or mental illness that is most likely to result in aggressive behavior from legally obtaining firearms. I stand with the majority of Americans who back a ban on assault-style rifles and limits on high-capacity magazines, such that have been used in the deadly and seemingly more frequent mass shootings in recent years. Now, with the strong probability that there are many in this progressive congregation who are on the side of stricter gun regulation, I nevertheless suppose that there may be gun enthusiasts even among us who do not desire any gun regulation at all. I've heard the argument that once we start limiting gun rights, it will have a domino effect, opening the door to eventually repealing the Second Amendment, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. The NRA and the gun lobby are powerful organizations that have successfully resisted meaningful changes to gun laws. They have even been successful in squelching some federally funded research into gun violence. But this issue is more nuanced than mere gun regulation. Debate over gun regulation may be just subterfuge for something far deeper and darker at the core of our DNA. This is not a new phenomenon. Yes, the gun culture is in our national, historical, and constitutional DNA. How many of us just love to watch those old spaghetti westerns, movies, and TV shows, depicting what life was like not so long ago? Many of you are old enough to recall Gunsmoke, OK Corral, Have Gun, Will Travel, How the West Was Won, The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, starring Clint Eastwood. In the Wild, Wild West, the gun culture was glorified, and life was depicted by the power of the gun. Later, popular movies were made about the lives of such characters as Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde. The way of the gun was the way of life. The gunslingers and the outlaws faced off with the sheriff's deputies, and the cavalry faced off with the Indians, who they believed were the evil, barbaric others, while they themselves were the good ones. this was just not a culture. It was not just a culture of the law versus the outlaws. Even politicians would even sometimes solve their conflicts with guns. Surely we can recall the history lesson about Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr's duel. This dichotomy of good guys versus bad guys will continue to play itself out even in gun incidents of today. Why then are we so surprised that today there's rampant gun production and consumption with little, if any, safeguards and regulation? So I ask, are guns and gun violence not in our DNA? Personally, I've been touched by both the power and pain of what a gun represents and can do. In fact, I have a family history where we have dealt with all kinds of violence. 2 of my brothers were brutally murdered in 2 separate incidents of violence. And a 17-year-old nephew was lost his life before he had a chance to live it, shot to death at the hands of another 17-year-old over my nephew's refusal to join a gang. Growing up, my father was a very abusive man. He wanted to be a gangster. He was a felon, and he would come home drunk and shoot up the house to instill fear and to terrorize his wife and children. My mother said that he, on several occasions, would put the gun to her temple and threaten to shoot her brains out just because he could. Throughout his life, he would be involved in the deaths of 3 men in 3 separate acts of violence, 2 of which were gun-related violence. He would spend 2 long stretches in the penitentiary as a result. The first stretch was on death row, which was later commuted to life with the possibility of parole. And he was paroled in 1976, only to return to prison 15 years later. While I make no excuse for my father's behavior, I do understand the types of violence associated with poverty, oppression, the lack of opportunities, and education. What happens when a powerless and oppressed man has a gun? Having an instrument of death, one might feel emboldened to kill, to steal, and to pursue paths of destruction, even within his own community. This is what people of color often face from within their own communities. The power dynamic is something I rarely hear discussed, and yet it is something that is probably linked to more violence than we know. The ultimate power that a gun gives its handler. In an article for The Guardian entitled Gun Demanding, The Psychology of Why People Want Firearms, author and neuroscientist Dean Burnett writes, many gun owners confess to feeling vulnerable or naked without their guns. Perhaps this isn't surprising. Having a gun gives you considerable power over people. If you feel small or weak or underachieving or anything like this, dealing with others can induce a great deal of social anxiety. A gun would provide at least one easy way where you can have the advantage over them for once, even if this reasoning only occurs at a subconscious level. But both my mother and grandmother kept firearms. Growing up, my brothers and sisters and I always knew Mom had a small pistol in her purse. As a single mother raising 9 children after my father went to prison, my mother said she had to have a gun for protection of herself and her children. She recalls several incidents where the gun proved to be her salvation. She speaks of one such incident when she invited some neighbors over for dinner and drinks. We children had all gone to bed, and she had gone upstairs to check on us when she heard some raised voices downstairs. She returned to see what was going on. She discovered that something had set off her 6'4", nearly 300-pound male neighbor. What upset him to this day, she said she doesn't know, but He with blazing eyes and a large open switchblade was walking towards this 5'6", 145-pound woman, threatening to, as she put it, to cut her blank to blank neck off. Now, blank to blank were expletives, for those of you who are wondering. But little did he know he brought a knife to a gun battle. She said something had told her to get her peace. And I'm trying, my nearly 80-year-old mother described this as you get a trip. Something had told her to get her peace while she was upstairs. And that talked about the peace like the flowing river peace. Talk about her piece of steel. And so she pulled it out, and the bullets began to fly, as did the 300-pound neighbor. She said he was ducking and diving, and he hit the screen door, almost knocking it off the hinges as he flew out of the house. The two women, his wife and sister, who had said nothing as he threatened my mother, were screaming, "Don't kill him," as they ran after him. She said she was glad that she didn't kill him, all the bullets missed, because she said she wouldn't want to have lived with that man's death on her conscience, even if it was self-defense. She said no, she had no doubt that he would have killed me, she said, while my children were in the house. I asked Mom, I said, "Did you call the police?" She said, "Nah, baby, in those days we just shut the door and went to bed." Interviewing her for this sermon, I asked her how long has she carried a gun. She indicated that it was for most of her adult life up until around the year 2000. She said it was like having an accessory, like earrings or lipstick. It was always there. She said one day while she was in church, I had just preached, and she was looking for money in her purse to give to the offering and realized the gun was there. She said she felt convicted as a woman of faith in a church with a pistol in her purse. Said she took it out that day and hadn't carried it since. However, she said lately she'd been thinking about putting it back in there. Now, some may want to judge my mama, but that was her reality and mine. According to a 2017 Pew survey on public views about guns, there has been a growing trend among African Americans who support gun ownership rights in recent years. With that said, I feel I should say a bit about the good guy with the gun concept. See, I am painfully aware that people like me, the people that look like me, do not automatically fall under Clint Eastwood's category of good. I am likely to fall under the categories of the bad or the ugly. Not only must I contend with the bad guy within my community, one who perhaps feels empowered by the gun, I, as a person of color, especially a male of color, must also contend, if not more so, with the so-called good guy in larger society. Hear me out. In Oklahoma, where I am originally from, there's now an open carry law on the books. At everyday places, you might encounter a gun-toting patriot walking in his freedom to carry. And I have to wonder if some, perhaps emboldened by the gun, actually seek situations and opportunities where they get to use them. His right to carry is a clear and present reminder to me as a black male of color, that at any time, this good person with the gun can take control over and destroy my black body. And regardless of my 3 college degrees and the community work that I do, if I am shot dead by a good guy with a gun, whatever story that shooter tells about my death, that's the one that will be believed. It could simply be his feeling threatened. Without a doubt, some will then scour my past to find a reason and justification for why this good guy ended my life. Now, that's my reality. You see, there's another reality within the community that I'm from. The Second Amendment doesn't really apply to people that look like me. Shall I get an amen on that one? Amen. There seems to be a double standard within the gun culture. I am keenly aware that if I walked around with a gun on my hip, somebody is likely to feel threatened. And the cops would be called, and as a person of color, I don't have the luxury or the freedom to gamble with the possibility of interacting with the police while armed. Even with a permit following an officer's commands and with acknowledging that he had a gun, Philando Castile was shot down in the prime of his life. And I can dare to claim that he was not shot down for having a gun. He was shot for the suspect that was his blackness. No one was held accountable for his death, and the NRA was silent about his right to carry. John Crawford III, also a black man, was killed by 2 police officers after someone reported him for carrying what turned out to be a toy rifle at a Walmart. The shooting occurred in Beaver Creek, Ohio, a state where the residents are allowed to legally carry guns openly in public, including stores. When 3 rookie police officers investigating a report of a possible burglary at a metal recycling plant came upon Earl Brown, a 73-year-old black man in Lauderhill, Florida. They did not take him for a night watchman. On that night, he carried a .44 caliber Magnum pistol, and officers yelled at him to put his hands up. As Mr. Brown raised his hands and said, "I'm security," the officers met him with a barrage of 22 bullets, 2 of which struck him. Mr. Brown was a security guard carrying a licensed gun. 2 weeks later, while at the hospital, he had a heart attack and died. Mr. Brown's widow, Gloria, wrote in an email, "Honestly, I hear the NRA talking about the right to bear arms. He had the right to bear his that night. They just never told us he wouldn't have the right to life. It seems like white men and police officers are the only ones who have the right to bear arms in this country." Such incidents underscores concerns about racial profiling among police and how that affects gun rights for different races. Reverend Ken Blanchard, an African-American and former police firearms instructor and U.S. Marines and author of the Black Man with a Gun, says his concerns as a black man about wearing guns openly, even though some whites are comfortable doing so, cuts to the nexus of guns and race in America. He states, "It's the same thing since the Civil War. It hasn't changed. We have a holdover from the sins of our fathers. It is an issue with long historical roots. As far back as the 17th century and the British colonies expressly prohibited gun ownership among black people and Indians. The Second Amendment was ratified and adopted in 1971, some 71 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And even afterwards, local judges and sheriffs administered gun permits in racially discriminatory ways. And when California legislature, the California legislature banned open carry in 1960, it was in response to the Black Panthers openly wielding guns at the state capitol. And I want to be clear that while we are having this big debate about guns, that we don't leave this very important component, the component of race, out of the equation. So on one hand, we have the powerful gun lobby that resists any productive conversation about curbing gun violence and that portrays any measure of gun control as an assault on our very freedoms. On the other side, we have the liberal media who seems to sensationalize incidents and will often misinterpret basic gun knowledge, facts, and numbers. Meanwhile, racial minorities who may want to own a gun merely for protection are afraid of being shot by the police by making them feel threatened. America is seemingly stuck in between opposing forces, the desire to exercise responsibly a constitutional right and the desire to live one's life in peace, where it is not continuously threatened by random acts of violence. The paradox here is that the ideal peace and the ideal freedom appear to be at odds. How could we possibly come to the middle on this very dividing issue? In an article by Sam Harris, written shortly after Newton massacre, Sam, a gun owner himself, attempts to present points related to guns. Some of his points I completely disagree with, while others I find quite enlightening. Nevertheless, what stood out for me was that he, an avid supporter of gun rights, and I, a UU minister, could both agree on a lot. He writes, "The Constitution of the United States was written by men who could not possibly have foreseen any change that would occur in American society in the ensuing centuries. Even if the Second Amendment guaranteed everyone the right to possess whatever weapon he or she desired, it doesn't. We have since invented weapons that no civilian should be allowed to own." He further states, "We could do many things to ensure that only fully vetted people could get a firearm license. The fact that guns in the U.S. can be legally purchased from private sellers without background checks on the buyers, the so-called gun show loophole, is terrifying. Getting a gun license could be made as difficult as getting a license to fly an airplane, requiring dozens of hours of training. I would certainly be happy to see policy changes like this. In that respect, I support much stricter gun laws." Maybe this is what we need to do. Resisting polarizing forces, we ought to come to the middle and seek to enact those laws that various sides agree on. Despite the fact that certain people on opposing sides seem to want to color the issues surrounding the debate as black and white, there are mostly gray areas. All that the polarization has accomplished so far is prevent these issues from finding resolutions. At the same time, there are a number of things in which Americans on all sides of the debate can agree on. This is where we need to expend our biggest effort, and this is precisely why organizations like North Carolinians Against Gun Violence are important. An excerpt from their mission statement reads, "We endorse measures that deal with underlying reasons for violence, such as poverty, lack of jobs, family breakdown, alcohol and drug abuse, anger, despair, and much more." I'm cutting it a little short, I know we're out of time. They have a monumental task of having to change the conscience of a community and our addiction, if you will, toward violence. Let's applaud their noble efforts. 2 more minutes. They and we must address the underlying causes of violence and insist on not allowing the middle ground to be rejected or the productive dialogue to be hijacked. As our society is renegotiating the balance of power, peace, freedom, and justice, we as Unitarian Americans often exemplify the idea of how people of diverse cultural, ethnic, theological, and even ideological backgrounds can come to live together peacefully and support one another. For this is what we are called to do in these turbulent times. We simultaneously affirm peace and seek freedom. Regarding human freedom, one of our organization's theological principles state the following: most human beings are free moral agents with the capacity to make choices and are accountable for these choices. Human freedom may be used creatively or destructively. These possibilities are expressed not only in our individual choices and actions, but also in the institutions and social structures we create. Peace is the product of human choice that empower human agency and extend the possibilities for human freedom. With all the arguments and debates about gun rights and ownership, with my personal history and present reality, I choose peace. I have ultimately concluded that I don't need a gun on my hip to feel strong or to feel protected. My intellect, education, and experience make me feel mighty strong. And knowledge is my weapon of choice. And while knowledge may not stop a good, bad, or ugly guy with a gun, I cannot live my life in fear of any of them, because there is no peace or freedom in fear. Every day I have to choose to trust, and perhaps you have to choose to trust as well. We have to choose to put our trust in the better angels of our neighbor's nature. We must trust that we, as well as our loved ones, will only encounter those who will have goodwill toward us and them. May it be so. Amen.